Chocobo's Dungeon 2. One of the underappreciated game of its time, considering its genre is rather unique. For a game that's classified as an RPG with its true nature of being a roguelike or dungeon crawler game, it's not a popular genre for a lot of people to agree on, despite its appeal towards a specific set of audiences. As for me, I grew up with these kinds of games before, more specifically with the mystery dungeon games, such as Torneko The Last Hope and both the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue Rescue Team. I've also played Reciteer, but that's already outside of the Mystery Dungeon series. This game seemed to be rated poorly by numerous different reviews. I wanted to see it for myself of how good I remember this game can be. I end up replaying it as a whole, completing most of every parts of it, including the secret ending, secret dungeons, and the rebuild dungeons. This is K1PM. This time I'll be doing a full review of Chocobo's Dungeon 2. I'll be going more in depth about the game and pointing out the pros and the cons of it. Chocobo's Dungeon 2 was developed and published by Squaresoft, or known as Square Enix as we know it today. One of the giants within the gaming industry that made a bunch of notable games in the past. Although this particular development of the game had a little help from Chunsoft in a different kind of way. Having the founder of Chunsoft on board, Koichi Nakamura had his fair share on helping the development of the game, following the same mystery dungeon formula on one of their previous titles. From the 8-directional turn-tile-based movements, to the food consumption, dungeon shops, unknown items to discover, and a lot more. But on this game's case has its unique charm, what creates an appeal towards the mystery dungeon fans or to those who like the roguelike formula at an early age. As a Square Enix game, the game offers an alright lighthearted story, following the story of Chocobo's adventure, along with 3 different partners, depending on which part of the events can be. There's also another partner that you could bring along named Kuz, although he's only available during the extra parts of the game, after the main ending story. Well, to be fair, it's not exactly that great, considering there were some of the things that didn't get explained, or how some of the plot of the story seem a bit too forced and going through different dungeons. But I guess it's an alright one that I could say. It's not perfect, but considering for a spin-off game on Chocobo's kind of theme, well, I'll give it a pass. Although, there were some of the notable scenes that made me remember of the game quite a lot, like Mrs. Bomb still ends up caring for Shiroma, but somewhat a bit in denial at first, then later on she ends up accepting her, or how Shiroma's struggle over past confrontation from the future. I know that time traveling story is a bit of a sketchy subject, but they kinda went simpler on this case at the very least. For those who wanted to skip the story summary of the game, you could head down to this section instead. The story follows Chocobo and Mog's treasure hunting adventure, but later on stumbles upon a problem that involves the whole village, along with Shiroma the White Mage and a different version of Sid, including Bahamut himself within the story, even though he kinda looks like a bit of a generic dragon of some sort. But oh well. Although the story mainly focuses on Shiroma's part, trying to discover who she is and where she is exactly from, while being observed and getting help from Bahamut himself. Shiroma soon in turn finds herself getting lost from her own existence, being an outcast within the village for being a human, especially from her own foster mother, Mrs. Bomb, and her kids, even though she actually cares for her, but just doesn't realize or accept it at first. But later on, she comes into terms that she really does worry for Shiroma's well-being. Later on though, she ends up getting caught by the enemy. She somehow managed to escape from the enemy alone, and then decides to go back to the future, along with a whole dungeon that her dad had made before, from a different future civilization, using the pendant as the key that she asked Chocobo to return it to. But after she left along with a whole dungeon, it turns out it actually came back in a much better state. The dungeon that fell into the ocean is a huge robot that could obliterate the whole village. Well, it doesn't exactly say it here, but it kinda looks like it. With the help of Sid, Bahamut, the Black Mages, and the rest of the other monsters within the village, they somehow manage to knock over the whole thing. After beating the final boss in the game, Chocobo ends up reuniting with Shiroma. Then later on, they manage to escape the whole collapsing dungeon, while leaving Mog behind. I'm not even sure how Mog managed to survive that fall. In the end though, the final boss of the game turns out to be that average enemy from before, that ends up possessing this doll in Shiroma's room, giving it a second chance in life. Then later on, Mog went on adventuring alone, but was surprised by Chocobo to join along. And that's what happened overall. Well, I may have skipped quite a few things, but that's what generally happened. And yeah, that's why I called it a light-hearted story at the start. It's alright to be honest, considering this is more of a spin-off kind of game after all. Its appeal is towards a much younger audience. And playing this as a kid before, I actually like it, despite how short it is. Now aside from that, for those who've been wondering what's the connection to the first Chocobo's Dungeon game, there isn't that much I believe. The only recurring character were Chocobo, Mog, and Chip, while the story itself doesn't attribute from the previous game. The gameplay on the other hand is actually quite decent. For a roguelike dungeon crawler game with the elements of a tiled turn-based game, it balances out the kind of style they go for. It follows a linear story and dives along on each randomly generated floor of a dungeon. It can sometimes be generous on the items to discover, or it can be a bit too harsh, containing a lot of traps and a few items available. The usual kind of setup in a roguelike or dungeon crawler genre, but in a much random environment, I'd say. What's unique in a mystery dungeon games, you could create your very own path by breaking the walls and stuffs around. Or if you end up accidentally became a frog or a monster that could go on water, you could go across to such place. When a player ends up dying in a single run, you're automatically returned outside of the dungeon, restarting throughout the whole dungeon floors again. And that's just how usually roguelike games are. Although some do offer a kind of shortcut once a player manages to reach a certain place. This game has that one too. As I mentioned a while ago, the game follows the same set of formula on what Chunsoft have developed in the past, Torneko no Daiboken Fushigi no Dungeon, and other mystery dungeon games, such as the various types of items available to use without knowing what it is at the start, having the need on identifying it first, or risk on using it or throwing it to remember its effects. The hunger meter and the dungeon shops are available on a random floor. Mystery dungeon games usually follow this kind of formula. What's unique thing here are the inclusion of different kinds of spells in a consumable item kind of format. The wide range of feathers to collect provides more spells, summons, and even passive buffs for Chocobo. Power Stones let you summon different kinds of powerful beings within the Final Fantasy universe. Monsters can also level up and evolve into a much stronger version of themselves. And also the two-player partner feature, which is a bit broken, but I guess it's fun in a way to have it. First of all is the consumable book spells feature. It's actually surprising how the game has a bunch of different spells available to use, while being able to level up certain spells based on the number of times used up makes an interesting twist on the game. This kinda ends up letting you hoard a lot of different spellbooks when possible. Well, at the very least, the book themselves is stackable, so yeah, there's that. With the help of different feathers to collect, the spells can gain a much wider range to attack the enemy. While there's the addition of 3 kinds of spellbooks that offers a lot more different spells to use. And these spells can be really powerful once you unlock the more useful ones. Like the very useful Buff Haste, the powerful Boss Killer Meteorite spell, or even the Ultima spell that can wipe out almost every enemy in sight. But there's a catch to it. It's not exactly that easy to collect those said spells. Feathers are needed to expand the number of spells to cast, and those feathers are actually really hard to acquire. There are some cases that would be given to Chocobo during conversations from this certain black mage, but it'll only offer a few times. you still gotta have to farm it through completing dungeons to gain another one, or through various hidden parts of the game, like helping this Marlboro out in remembering his original body that turns out to be Ramu in the end, or helping this behemoth sculptor to accidentally free Titan from the statue. Although when farming for most of the feathers, it kinda becomes quite a bit too repetitive to get them all, honestly. On my full playthrough of the game, I don't exactly need to collect all of them. I just only need to get a few important ones, and it's all good. Grinding levels in the game aren't that important. The stats and HP gained per level are not that high compared to traditional RPG games. But at the same time, it's a bit easier to level up. What's important here the most is the grinding of the items themselves. Discovering a variety types of unknown items that could end up polishing your equipments or spelling your doom, to collecting a bunch of healing potions and haste potions, as well as combining equipments into a much powerful kind. Pair these mechanics with a spell system and summoning features, and the game actually offers a decent unique setup. The huge downside that I see in this is that the items you discover can also be forgotten accidentally with the use of Amnesia Potion, or those mask enemies that laughs at you to forget your stuff. It's kind of a bit inconvenient that happens from time to time, having the risk of using it or throwing those stuffs around. Not even the unknown description of an item helps, as it also becomes randomized when forgotten. And if you're that willing on taking the items, you could actually rob the item shop from a dungeon. But it's a really risky move to pull it off, considering how strong these Reaper monsters can be. Not even those teleportation tags would help you rob the place, since it's disabled if you try to use it while carrying a shop item with you. It's a fun little way of stealing, I guess, if you want to try risking it. One of the things that I find the game amazing is how brilliant the enemies can be. I'm actually quite surprised how some of the enemies can fight one another all of a sudden, and ends up getting stronger than before. Or how some of the monsters would end up merging into a different monster to evolve in a much stronger state. It might sound a bit unconventional, but this is what creates the sense of challenge in it. I actually never seen this kind of idea before on the older games, that lets monsters act more naturally with their own environment, while having different sets of AI that takes advantage of what a player does, especially those annoying mages that keeps running away from the player as much as they can. It's good how smart some of the AI can be. At the same time, it can be really annoying though. Although the bosses in the game are pretty much alright though. It's funny how they get creative with the boss's design. Like the first boss ends up splitting up its parts while its heart tries to run away, and how tricky the battle against those robo-imps at the top of the Sid's tower, or how Ultros from Final Fantasy VI makes his appearance on this game, acting as the boss that's on the water area. He even has those lines that he usually says. The final boss of the game, however, feels a bit too simple on the other hand. They could have worked it out better than just giving it another round. It's kinda a bit disappointing in a way, to be honest. I mean, sure it's hard if you're not that well equipped, but I was kinda expecting a lot more for a final boss. You know, kinda like the first boss in a way. Even for the secret boss, Leviathan was sadly not that great. It kinda feels sad a bit that he's more of a joke character there. I mean, I was surprised that Ultros was really there, with his very own different theme for the Chocobo's dungeon game. But Leviathan on the other hand kinda feels out of place, in my opinion. As do most mystery dungeon games, you're accompanied by a partner of choice, or forced depending on the story. Chocobo's Dungeon 2 on the other hand is the first mystery dungeon game to ever have a partner beside the player. Not to mention how the game offers a lot of unique partners to accompany the player. Whether it'll be Shiroma, the white mage with her powerful heals, Sid, the beefy strongman that can pulverize the enemy and plant pointless mines, or Mog, who's pretty much a standard companion overall. Nothing that special other than Mog's strong growth in the end. Although I do know that Mog can steal an equipment from the enemy, but that happened only once, and for some reason never again. There's also Kuz. you know, the final boss that turns into a doll, a companion that you could bring along. But it's not that strong since Kuz is more of a wall than your average companion. But he can shoot some laser beam magic that could shrink the enemy down. What's best out of all, you could collect more of the red feathers in order to unlock more summons that would act as a companion for you, instead of just using a power stone to cast their specialty alone. When they end up passing away, they would cast one final special before they'll be gone forever, until you manage to find another duplicate feather of them, which again it's really hard to get one. The art style, however, is pretty much alright, to be honest. They went softer with the pixel art that blends well with the background. Compared to the previous game before, I kinda prefer this one overall. I know and understand that it's all cutesy and stuff, kind of like a game for kids considered by a lot of people. I mean, it is somewhat targeted to a younger audience after all, with a bit of complexity in the game's mechanics. But you know what? I'd say it's all good, to be honest. It fits quite well with the game's theme, with Chocobo being the main leading character. The level design on the dungeon itself is pretty much standard. Different randomly generated rooms, various sets of traps on the floor, and stuffs to fill along with the enemies. While after a few floors, the theme of the stage changes, creating a bit of variety towards each of the dungeon's theme, along with its background theme depending on which dungeon and floor that the player has reached. And for a PlayStation 1 game, they actually did it good. I actually like it. Mixing up with Sid's marching-like theme to the mystical music within the dungeons, even how each of the bosses' theme of the game sounds amazing, especially on the Imp boss's Robo stage. I love how epic the music can be, fighting against them. And I did notice some of the borrowed soundtracks from the other Final Fantasy franchise, especially Final Fantasy IV's Theme of Love. That soundtrack was memorable for me, especially how it fits very well with Shiroma's case, with her past connection to the future and all. That's why I give this game a rating of 8.3 out of 10. As a person who've played a lot of different mystery dungeon, JRPG, and roguelike games in the past, I can safely say that Chocobo's Dungeon 2 surely did an absolute amazing job as a Square Enix game in terms of quality. It's unfortunate that it wasn't well received by a lot of people. They usually don't exactly appreciate this kind of genre. It caters to a much specific set of audiences that not a lot of people might enjoy. But if you're a fan on the whole roguelike aspect or mystery dungeon series itself, I'm quite sure you'll enjoy this game as a whole. And of course, the game isn't exactly perfect as it is. There are still some problems in between, like the whole forgetting an item aspect is quite annoying, including on how hard to collect all of the feathers can be in the game, or how some parts of the story just seem to be missing. It's kinda a shame there. If you're into these kinds of genres, I highly recommend you to try out the game for yourself. Or if you're still skeptical about it, you could try watching on my full playthrough of the game over here. It includes a huge array of timestamps if you want to check out the specific parts of the game there. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you consider subscribing to my channel, please do follow me on my Twitter account for more updates, in case something bad might happen all of a sudden. There's still a way to contact me over there. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.